The gunshot echoed across the plains as Tessa O'Brien ducked behind an overturned wagon, her heart hammering against her ribs like a wild stallion. The year was 1876, and what should have been a routine journey from Santa Fe to Denver had turned into a nightmare when outlaws ambushed their wagon train at dawn. She clutched her bleeding arm, trying to stem the flow with the torn fabric of her once pristine blue dress, now stained with dust and blood. "Pa," she called out weakly, her voice barely audible over the continued gunfire. No response came from where she'd last seen her father standing his ground. The pit in her stomach grew as the shooting suddenly stopped, replaced by the ominous sound of approaching footsteps. Tessa held her breath, pressing herself against the splintered wood of the wagon. She was 22, too young to die in this desolate stretch of the Colorado Territory. The footsteps grew closer. She closed her eyes, preparing for the worst. "Miss, are you hurt?" The voice was deep but gentle, distinctly different from the rough shouts of the bandits. She opened her eyes to find a tall figure crouching before her, his face partially obscured by the shadow of his wide-brimmed hat. His eyes, though, were visible a striking blue that reminded her of summer skies back home in Missouri. They killed everyone," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Not everyone," he replied, holstering his revolver. "The outlaws are gone. I scared them off, but they might return. We need to move." He extended a calloused hand toward her. "Name's Mack Miller. Most folks call me Mac." Tessa hesitated before taking his hand. Tessa O'Brien. As he helped her to her feet, the full devastation of the attack became clear. Bodies lay scattered across the trail, the Kind family from Ohio, the elderly couple headed to see their grandchildren, and there, by the lead wagon, her father's still form. A sob escaped her throat. "My pa." Mac followed her gaze and his expression softened. "I'm sorry, Miss O'Brien." He gave her a moment to process her grief before speaking again. "We can't stay here. Those men will be back with reinforcements. I've got a horse nearby." Tessa knelt beside her father's body, tears streaming down her dirt-streaked face. She gently closed his unseeing eyes, whispering a quick prayer before removing the silver pocket watch from his vest, the last remnant of her family she could carry. "I can't just leave him here," she said, her voice breaking. "We'll mark the spot," Mac assured her. "Once you're safe, I'll come back with the proper folks to give him and the others a decent burial." With trembling hands, Tessa allowed Mac to help her onto his chestnut stallion. As they rode away from the massacre, she clung to his back, too numb to feel embarrassed by the intimate position. The rhythm of the horse's hooves beneath them matched the pounding in her chest. "Where are you taking me?" she finally asked as the sun began its descent toward the horizon. "Silvercreek," he replied. "Small town about half a day's ride from here. Got a sheriff who's an old friend of mine." "You'll be safe there." Night fell quickly in the Colorado wilderness. When Mac finally stopped to make camp in a sheltered canyon, Tessa could barely keep her eyes open. The events of the day had drained her completely. She sat motionless on a fallen log while he efficiently built a small fire. "Let me take a look at that arm," Mac said, kneeling beside her with a canteen and a clean handkerchief. Tessa winced as he gently cleaned the wound. "It's just a graze," he assured her. "You're lucky?" "Lucky," she repeated, a bitter laugh escaping her lips. "My father is dead. Everyone I traveled with is dead. I'm alone in the middle of nowhere with a stranger. How is that lucky?" Mac's hand stilled for a moment. "You're alive, Miss O'Brien, and you won't be alone for long. Silvercreek has good people. They'll help you." "And then what?" Tears threatened again. "I have no family left, no money, nothing." "First things first," he said pragmatically, finishing the bandage on her arm. "Get you safe, get you fed, then worry about tomorrow." He handed her a strip of dried beef and a biscuit from his saddlebag. Tessa hadn't realized how hungry she was until the first bite touched her lips. They ate in silence, the crackling fire and distant coyote calls the only sounds disrupting the vast stillness. Later, as Mac wrapped his spare blanket around her shoulders, Tessa felt the full weight of her solitude descend upon her. "Thank you," she whispered, "for saving my life." "Get some rest," he replied, his voice softer than it had been all day. "I'll keep watch." Tessa lay down near the fire, using her arm as a pillow. Exhaustion pulled at her, but every time she closed her eyes, she saw the attack replaying in her mind. After an hour of fitful attempts at sleep, she sat up, finding Mack still alert, staring into the darkness beyond their small camp. "Can't sleep?" he asked without looking at her. "Every time I try, I see them, hear the gunshots." She hugged her knees to her chest. "Were you able to tell who they were, the men who attacked us?" Mack's jaw tightened. "Reckon it was the Donovan gang. They've been hitting wagon trains between Santa Fe and Denver for months now. Sheriff Haynes in Silvercreek has been trying to organize a posse, but they're elusive." "Why did you help me?" Tessa asked. "You could have ridden past, most would have." He was quiet for so long that Tessa thought he might not answer. Finally, he sighed. 5 years ago, my sister was traveling with her husband to California. Their wagon train was attacked. No one stopped to help. The fire illuminated the pain in his eyes. I couldn't ride past. The revelation hung between them in the cool night air. Tessa understood then that this taciturn cowboy carried his own grief, his own ghosts. "You should try to sleep again," he said, breaking the silence. "We've got a long ride tomorrow." This time when Tessa lay down, the exhaustion won out over the nightmares. She drifted off to the reassuring sight of Mack's silhouette against the starlit sky. Dawn came with a chill that penetrated the thin blanket. Tessa awoke to find Mack already up, saddling his horse and extinguishing what remained of their fire. "There's coffee," he said, nodding toward a small tin cup steaming near where she lay. Tessa wrapped her fingers around the warm metal, grateful for both the heat and the thoughtfulness. As the caffeine cleared the fog from her mind, the reality of her situation became clear again. She was entirely dependent on this stranger's goodwill. "How far to Silvercreek?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. "We should reach it by midday if we keep a good pace." Mack tightened the cinch on his saddle. "The town's grown some in recent years. Silver Mine opened up in '73, brought folks in. You might find work there while you figure out your next steps." Tessa nodded, though the prospect of building a new life from nothing terrified her. She had been trained to run a household, to embroider, to play the piano, skills that seemed worthless in the rough frontier town Mack described. They rode in silence for most of the morning, Tessa's arms wrapped around Mack's waist, her cheek occasionally resting against his broad back when fatigue overcame her. Despite the circumstances, she couldn't help noticing how solid he felt, how capable his hands looked on the reins. He couldn't be more than 30, she guessed, though the lines around his eyes suggested he'd seen more than his years might indicate. Around noon, they crested a hill, and Silvercreek came into view in the valley below a collection of wooden buildings straddling a fast-moving creek, with mountains rising majestically behind it. "It's not much," Mack said, "but it's a damn sight better than where we found each other." As they rode down the main street, Tessa felt eyes upon them. A woman on a horse was common enough, but her torn, blood-stained dress and the way she clung to Mack clearly marked her as someone in distress. They stopped in front of a 2-story building with Sheriff painted on a wooden sign above the door. Mack dismounted first, then reached up to help Tessa down. Her legs felt unsteady after so many hours on horseback. "Sheriff Haynes," Mack called as they entered the small office. A middle-aged man with a gray-streaked beard looked up from his desk, his expression shifting from surprise to concern as he took in Tessa's appearance. "Mack, what in tarnation? Donovan gang hit a wagon train yesterday about 20 miles south of here," Mack explained grimly. "Miss O'Brien is the only survivor I found." Sheriff Haynes removed his hat and stood. "I'm mighty sorry to hear that, madam. Please sit down." Tessa sank gratefully into the offered chair while Mack recounted the details of the attack and their journey. The sheriff's face darkened with each word. "Damn those animals," he muttered. "Been trying to catch them for months. This makes the 3rd wagon train they've hit." He turned to Tessa. Do you have any family we can contact, Miss O'Brien? She shook her head. My mother passed years ago. My father was all I had left. We were heading to Denver to stay with a distant cousin, but I've never met her. The sheriff exchanged a look with Mack. Well, we'll need to send a party out to the site, give those poor folks a proper burial. In the meantime, he hesitated. Mrs. Patterson at the boarding house might have a room. She's a good woman, might even have some work for you. I'll take her there, Mack said, his hand briefly touching Tessa's shoulder. And then I'll help organize a burial party. The boarding house sat at the end of the main street, a neat, two-story building with a small garden out front. Mrs. Patterson turned out to be a plump, motherly woman who clucked sympathetically when Mack explained Tessa's situation. You poor dear, she said, taking Tessa's hands in her own. Of course you can stay here. I've a small room on the second floor, and as it happens, I could use help with the cooking and cleaning. Relief washed over Tessa. Thank you, Mrs. Patterson. I'm a hard worker. I'm sure you are, dear. Now let's get you cleaned up and into some fresh clothes. You look dead on your feet. As Mrs. Patterson led her toward the stairs, Tessa turned back to Mack, suddenly reluctant to let him leave. He had become her anchor in the chaos of the past day. Mr. Miller, she called. Thank you for everything. He touched the brim of his hat. I'll check on you when I return, Miss O'Brien. Make sure you're settling in all right. She watched him walk back toward his horse, his tall figure silhouetted against the afternoon sun. Only when he disappeared from view did she follow Mrs. Patterson upstairs. The room was small but clean, with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a window overlooking the mountains. Mrs. Patterson brought a basin of warm water, clean towels, and a simple blue dress that she said had belonged to her daughter. She's married now, living in Denver, the older woman explained. This should fit you well enough until we can see about getting you some proper clothes. Left alone, Tessa stripped off her ruined dress and washed away the dirt and blood from her skin. Each splash of water seemed to reveal another bruise, another reminder of what she'd survived. When she finally looked in the small mirror above the washstand, a stranger stared back, a hollow-eyed young woman with a smudge of purple beneath her right eye and a haunted expression. That evening, she ate dinner with Mrs. Patterson and the boarding house's 3 other residents, an elderly schoolteacher, a young clerk from the assayer's office, and a widow who worked at the general store. They were kind, avoiding questions about her ordeal while making gentle conversation about the town and its happenings. Tessa learned that Silvercreek had grown rapidly in the past 3 years, since silver was discovered in the nearby mountains. The population had swelled from a few dozen to nearly 500 souls, with new arrivals weekly. And what about Mr. Miller? Tessa asked as Mrs. Patterson served apple pie. Does he live here in town? Mack, the widow, Mrs. Caldwell, smiled. He's got a small ranch about 5 miles outside town, raises horses mainly, keeps to himself mostly, but he's always ready to help when there's trouble. Finest horseman in the territory, the clerk, Mr. Perkins, added. And quick with that colt he carries, though he's not one to use it unless pushed. Later, in her room, Tessa sat on the edge of the bed, turning her father's pocket watch over in her hands, the weight of all she'd lost pressed down upon her. She was 22 years old, alone in a town of strangers with nothing but the clothes she'd been given and this single memento of her family. A soft knock at her door startled her. When she opened it, Mack stood in the hallway, hat in hand. He'd cleaned up, his dark hair still damp from washing, his shirt fresh. Forgive the late hour, he said. I wanted to let you know we're riding out at first light to take care of the burial. Tessa swallowed hard. I should come with you. Mack shook his head. It's not a sight you need to see again. Sheriff's bringing a minister. It'll be done proper, I promise you. She wanted to argue but found she didn't have the strength. Instead, she nodded, blinking back tears. There's something else, Mack continued. While we were organizing the burial party, I heard talk. The Donovan gang was spotted near Miller's Creek, not 30 miles from here. Sheriff's gathering men to go after them. You're going, Tessa said. It wasn't a question. His blue eyes met hers steadily. They need to be stopped before they hurt anyone else. Fear clutched at her heart, surprising her with its intensity. This man was little more than a stranger, yet the thought of him riding into danger disturbed her deeply. When will you leave? Day after tomorrow, most likely. After the burials, Tessa nodded, unsure what to say. Be careful seemed inadequate for what she felt. Mack shifted his weight, seeming equally at a loss. Finally, he said, Mrs. Patterson says she's put you to work already. Yes, Tessa confirmed, grateful for the change of subject. I'll be helping with meals and cleaning. It's good to have something to do. You'll do fine here, he said. Silvercreek's full of good people. An awkward silence fell between them. Tessa was suddenly acutely aware of how improper it was for him to be at her door so late, despite his honorable intentions. I should let you rest, Mack said, as if reading her thoughts. Good night, Miss O'Brien. Good night, Mr. Miller. After he left, Tessa sat on her bed for a long time, unable to settle her thoughts. The day had been overwhelming, from the kindness of Mrs. Patterson to the knowledge that the men who had murdered her father might soon face justice. But most unsettling was her reaction to Mack's imminent departure. Why should she care so much about what happened to him? The answer came unbidden, because he had saved her when no one else could. The next week passed in a blur of activity as Tessa settled into her new role at the boarding house. The work was harder than anything she'd done before: hauling water, scrubbing floors, helping prepare 3 meals a day for the residents, but she welcomed the physical exhaustion. It left her less time to dwell on her losses or worry about Mack and the posse, who had departed as planned 2 days after her arrival. 10 days after the attack, Tessa was hanging laundry in the back garden when she heard a commotion from the main street. Shouts and the thunder of hooves drew her attention. They're back, someone called. The posse is back. Tessa dropped the wet sheet she was holding and ran toward the front of the house. A group of riders was coming down the main street, dust billowing behind them. Her heart pounded as she scanned the faces, looking for Mack's tall figure. She spotted him near the back of the group, his hat pulled low. Relief flooded through her until she noticed he was slumped forward in his saddle, one arm clutched protectively against his side. Without thinking, she pushed through the gathering crowd toward him. Mr. Miller, he looked up at the sound of her voice, his face pale beneath his tan. Miss O'Brien, he acknowledged, his voice strained. We got them, all of them. You're hurt, she said, reaching up toward him. It's nothing, just a scratch. But as he tried to dismount, he staggered, nearly falling. Tessa moved quickly to support him, ignoring the curious looks from onlookers. Mrs. Patterson, she called. We need a room and hot water. Between Tessa and Sheriff Haynes, they managed to get Mack inside the boarding house and up to an empty room. Once he was seated on the bed, Tessa could see the extent of his injury: a blood-stained bandage wrapped hastily around his torso, visible through his torn shirt. The doctor's on his way, the sheriff assured her. Mack took a bullet meant for young Deputy Willis, probably saved the boy's life. When they removed his shirt, Tessa had to stifle a gasp. The wound in his side was angry and red, clearly infected despite the makeshift bandage. Mack's skin was hot to the touch, fever already taking hold. The next several hours were a blur of activity as the doctor arrived, cleaned and stitched the wound, and left instructions for Mack's care. Keep the fever down, he told Tessa and Mrs. Patterson. If it breaks by morning, he should recover. That night, Tessa sat by Mack's bedside, changing the cool cloths on his forehead as he tossed restlessly in his fevered sleep. Sometimes he called out names she didn't recognize, perhaps friends or family long gone. Other times he seemed to be reliving the gunfight with the Donovan gang, his hands clutching at invisible weapons. During one lucid moment near midnight, his blue eyes focused on her face. Tessa, he murmured, using her given name for the first time, you don't have to stay. I'm not leaving, she replied firmly, placing a fresh cloth on his brow. His hand caught hers, his grip surprisingly strong despite his weakened state. Why? The simple question deserved an honest answer. Because you didn't leave me when you could have. A ghost of a smile touched his lips before his eyes fluttered closed again. By dawn, Mack's fever had broken. Tessa, exhausted from her night's vigil, was dozing in the chair beside his bed when she felt a light touch on her arm. "You're still here," he said, his voice rough but clear. Tessa straightened, blinking away sleep. "How do you feel?" "Like I've been trampled by a herd of buffalo," he admitted, "but better than yesterday." Over the next week, Mack recovered his strength slowly under Tessa's watchful care. Mrs. Patterson, with a knowing gleam in her eye, adjusted Tessa's duties to allow her more time to tend to their injured guest. The other boarders, too, seemed unsurprised by her devotion, as if they had expected it all along. On the 8th day, Mack was well enough to sit on the porch in the afternoon sunshine. Tessa joined him, bringing a pitcher of lemonade and 2 glasses. "Doc says I can head back to my ranch tomorrow," he said as she poured. "I've imposed on Mrs. Patterson's hospitality long enough." "She doesn't mind," Tessa replied quickly. "None of us do." Mack studied her face. "And what about you, Miss O'Brien? How are you settling into Silvercreek?" Tessa considered the question. "Better than I expected. Mrs. Patterson says she'll keep me on permanently if I wish." "The work is hard but satisfying. You deserve more than being a boarding house maid," Mack said softly. "Do I?" Tessa looked down at her hands, calloused now from her new duties. "I'm grateful to have a roof over my head and honest work. That's more than many have. Still, a woman like you." "A woman like me," she repeated with a small smile. "And what kind of woman is that, Mr. Miller?" His gaze was steady, almost disconcertingly direct. "Brave, resilient, kind." The compliments warmed her more than they should have. She looked away, flustered. "I should check on dinner." As she stood to leave, Mack caught her hand. "Would you walk with me tomorrow? Before I leave, there's something I'd like to show you." Curiosity overcame her hesitation. "All right." The next morning dawned clear and crisp, with the first hint of autumn in the air. Tessa met Mack outside the boarding house where he waited with his horse. "It's not far," he assured her, offering his hand to help her up onto the saddle before mounting behind her. They rode in comfortable silence out of town, following the creek upstream. After about 20 minutes, they reached a small meadow nestled against the foothills, where wildflowers still bloomed in defiance of the approaching cold. "It's beautiful," Tessa breathed as Mack helped her down. "This is the northern edge of my property," he explained, leading her toward a small rise. "I bought it 3 years ago after." He paused. "After I lost my sister, needed somewhere to put down roots." As they reached the top of the rise, Tessa gasped. Below them stretched a modest ranch, a solid log cabin with a covered porch, a barn, corrals where several horses grazed, and beyond, a breathtaking view of the mountains. "Your home," she said. "It's not much," Mack replied, a hint of self-consciousness in his voice. "But it's mine, paid for. 20 acres of good grazing land. Creek runs through it year-round." Tessa turned to look at him, sensing there was more to this revelation than simple hospitality. "Why are you showing me this?" Mack removed his hat, turning it nervously in his hands. "When I found you that day, you were the bravest person I'd ever met. Most would have broken completely after what you'd been through, but not you." His sincerity made her uncomfortable. "I wasn't brave, I was terrified." "Being scared doesn't mean you're not brave," he countered. "It just means you keep going despite the fear." They stood in silence for a moment, the gentle breeze carrying the scent of pine and wildflowers. "I've been alone a long time," Mack finally continued. "After losing my family, I didn't think I'd ever want to risk caring about anyone again. But then you." He trailed off, clearly struggling to find the right words. Tessa's heart began to beat faster as she realized where this conversation was headed. "I know it's too soon," he said. "You've barely had time to grieve, to adjust to your new life here. And I'm not asking for any promises, but I wanted you to know that when you're ready, if you're ever ready, there's a place for you here." Tessa stared at him, emotions warring within her. Part of her wanted to run from the intensity of what he was offering. Another part recognized the rare gift being presented, a chance at belonging again, at having a home. "I don't know what to say," she admitted. You don't have to say anything now, Mack assured her. Just know the option exists. He paused, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his face. Unless the idea is completely unwelcome to you. No, Tessa said quickly. It's not unwelcome, it's just unexpected. Relief softened his features. Then that's enough for now. They spent another hour walking the property, Mack pointing out features and telling stories about the horses he bred. By the time they returned to town, the awkwardness had dissipated, replaced by a tentative understanding. At the boarding house door, Mack took her hand. I'll be by to check on you in a few days, if that's all right. I'd like that, Tessa replied, surprising herself with how much she meant it. True to his word, Mack began visiting regularly, sometimes bringing small gifts like wildflowers or honey from his beehives. Other times simply sharing a meal or offering to escort her on errands around town. As autumn deepened into winter, their friendship grew, comfortable and steady. In December, Mrs. Patterson hosted a small Christmas gathering for the boarders and a few townspeople. Tessa, wearing a new green dress she'd saved for weeks to purchase, found herself watching the door, waiting for Mack to arrive. When he finally appeared, snowflakes melting in his dark hair, her heart skipped a beat. He'd clearly made an effort with his appearance clean-shaven, wearing a new shirt and vest, his boots polished to a shine. You look beautiful, he said when he reached her side, his voice low enough that only she could hear. Tessa felt a blush warm her cheeks. Thank you. You clean up rather well yourself, Mr. Miller. As the evening progressed, with music from Mrs. Caldwell's piano and punch served in the boarding house's best glasses, Tessa found herself relaxing truly for the first time since the attack. When Mack asked her to step outside onto the porch for a moment, she went willingly. The night was clear and cold, stars brilliant above them, the street quiet under its blanket of snow. I have something for you, Mack said, reaching into his pocket. An early Christmas gift. He handed her a small package wrapped in brown paper and tied with a red ribbon. Inside was a delicate silver locket on a chain. Mack, it's beautiful, she breathed. But I can't, please, he interrupted. I want you to have it. As she opened the locket, she found it empty. For memories still to be made, Mack explained, if you'll let me be part of them. Tessa looked up at him, this man who had saved her life and then, slowly, carefully, helped her find a reason to live it fully again. I'd like that very much, she whispered. He stepped closer, his hand gently cupping her cheek. May I? She nodded, and his lips met hers in a kiss so tender it brought tears to her eyes. When they parted, she found herself clinging to his coat lapels, suddenly afraid he would disappear like everything else she had loved. Don't leave me alone, she whispered, the words escaping before she could stop them. Mack's arms tightened around her, his voice fierce with promise. Never again. Spring arrived in a riot of wildflowers, turning the meadows around Mack's ranch into a sea of color. On a perfect May afternoon, Tessa stood in Mrs. Patterson's best guest room, allowing the older woman to adjust the simple white veil in her hair. You look radiant, my dear, Mrs. Patterson said, stepping back to admire her handiwork. Mack won't know what hit him. Tessa smiled, fingering the silver locket that hadn't left her neck since Christmas. Inside now was a tiny portrait of her father on one side, and on the other, a lock of Mack's dark hair. I never thought I'd find happiness again, she admitted. Not after everything that happened. Mrs. Patterson squeezed her hand. Life has a way of surprising us, doesn't it? Sometimes the worst moments lead us to the best people. The small church in Silvercreek was filled with townspeople who had become friends over the past year. Sheriff Haynes stood as Mack's best man, while Mrs. Caldwell played the wedding march on the organ. When Tessa walked down the aisle, her borrowed dress shimmering in the light from the stained glass windows, she saw only Mack waiting for her, his blue eyes shining with a love so pure it took her breath away. Later, as they rode together toward their ranch, their home, Tessa rested her head against her husband's back, marveling at how far they had come since that terrible day on the trail. Happy? Mack asked, reaching back to squeeze her hand where it rested against his waist. "More than I ever thought possible," she replied truthfully. As the cabin came into view, Tessa thought about the journey that had brought her here through unimaginable loss to unexpected love. She had learned that grief wasn't something you overcame, it was something you carried, its weight eventually balanced by new joys. "I was thinking," Mack said as he helped her down from the horse, "that extra room might make a nice nursery someday, if you wanted." Tessa smiled up at him, seeing their future unfold before her children running through the meadow, growing old together on the porch watching sunsets, building a legacy of love on this land they both cherished. "I'd like that," she said. "Very much." As he carried her across the threshold of their home, Tessa knew with absolute certainty that though the road had been harder than she could have imagined, it had led her exactly where she was meant to be in the arms of a man who had promised never to leave her alone, and who had kept that promise in ways greater than either of them could have dreamed.